It's 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday in Tehran, November 4th, 1979.
Right.
And there's this young female university student walking toward the main gates of the United States Embassy.
Just a normal morning. Right.
Exactly, except underneath her shador, her traditional Islamic cloak, she is hiding this massive, heavy pair of metal bolt cutters.
Wow.
Yeah. And in just a few minutes, she's going to pull those cutters out, snap the chains holding the gate shut, and wave in, like, hundreds of her fellow students.
And that one act.
Yeah, that single physical act of breaking a lock is going to inadvertently trap an American president. It's going to serve as the fiery crucible for a brand new theocratic regime and basically freeze global geopolitics in this block of ice that honestly hasn't thawed in over 4 decades.
I mean, it really is the ultimate butterfly effect moment in modern international relations. You have this action that was intended to last maybe a few hours. A weekend at most. Right, exactly. A weekend at most. And it spirals into this grueling 444-day standoff.
Right. Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you on a really comprehensive investigation into the 1979 Iran hostage crisis.
We're looking at the complete anatomy of a geopolitical earthquake here.
We really are. And we aren't just going to cover the terrifying days inside that embassy compound, though. I mean, we are definitely going to get into the harrowing ground-level details of what those 66 original American captives endured.
Yeah, we have to. But we're also going to explore the deep historical background that built up all that pressure, right? The intense domestic and international political maneuvering.
Oh, and the unprecedented media circus that totally paralyzed Washington, plus the monumental consequences that followed.
And to do this justice, we're pulling from an incredible stack of sources today.
We really got into the weeds on this one.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at declassified National Archives records that show, the raw intelligence and the closed-door policy debates. We have academic papers dissecting U.S. Iran political relations.
And the psychological frameworks of the conflict, which is super fascinating.
Right. Plus, we're utilizing the official International Court of Justice case overview to really understand the legal and diplomatic wreckage.
Which is a mess.
A total mess. And crucially, we are centering some deeply personal first-hand accounts from former hostages, like the press attaché, Barry Rosen, to kind of ground this massive geopolitical event in actual human reality.
Yeah, because it's easy to get lost in the politics and forget the people. But before we jump into the timeline, I do want to give you a quick disclaimer.
Good idea.
The source material we are covering today involves some really intense political, ideological, and international conflicts. I mean, we are dealing with raw history here.
Right, with passionate, highly conflicting viewpoints on literally all sides.
Exactly. So our goal in this deep dive is to impartially report the facts, the perspectives, and the historical records directly from those sources.
We aren't here to take any political sides or, endorse any specific ideology.
No, not at all. We are simply conveying the original source material so you can understand the full scope, the how, and the why of what actually happened.
And the why is really the critical piece here. I mean, when we look at a crisis of this magnitude, there is this huge temptation to just start the clock on the day the embassy was breached.
November 4th.
Right. But the students who poured over those walls on November 4th, they weren't reacting to some spontaneous sudden anger.
No.
They were reacting to a quarter century of history.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we really want to understand why a group of Iranian university students felt entirely justified in storming a diplomatic compound, we have to rewind the clock.
We have to go back.
Yeah, we are traveling back 25 years before the crisis, right to 1953.
Because in the minds of the people who organized the takeover, the inciting incident wasn't, anything Jimmy Carter did in 1979.
Right.
The original sin, the root cause of all this paranoia and anger was the 1953 coup d'etat.
Operation Ajax.
Exactly. Known in intelligence circles as Operation Ajax.
So let's build that world for the listener. Like, what is the geopolitical reality of Iran in the early 1950s? Why is the West so intensely focused on this specific country?
Well, it all comes down to the most critical resource of the 20th century, right? Oil.
Always oil.
Always. Post-World War II, the global demand for petroleum is just skyrocketing. It is the absolute lifeblood of industrial economies, of modern militaries. And Iran happens to sit on massive, easily accessible oil reserves.
But there's a catch.
There's a huge catch. The complication, at least from the Iranian public's perspective, was that their sovereign wealth wasn't actually staying in Iran at all.
Right. It was being drained.
Totally. The extraction, the refining, the sale of Iranian oil, It was almost entirely controlled by the British.
Through a massive corporate entity, right?
Yeah, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Which would eventually become BP, for context.
Exactly.
So you basically have a foreign corporation operating as this untouchable sovereign entity right inside Iran's borders.
And operating with staggering inequality. I mean, the British executives and the managers, they lived in these manicured enclaves in cities like Abadan.
Like little British bubbles.
Exactly. Swimming pools, cinemas, imported luxury goods. Meanwhile, the Iranian laborers who were actually pulling the oil out of the ground,
The ones doing the real work.
right, they lived in squalid slums without basic running water or electricity.
Yeah.
So the Iranian public was just watching the profits from their own natural resources get siphoned off to London, leaving their own domestic economy incredibly weak.
I mean, that level of visible daily inequality is just a potent recipe for nationalism, which perfectly paves the way for a figure like Mohammad Mossadegh to step onto the center stage.
Mossadegh is such a fascinating historical figure. He was highly educated. He had studied law in Europe. He was technically an aristocrat, but he became this fierce, uncompromising Iranian nationalist.
So when he becomes prime minister,
When he becomes prime minister in 1951, he rides this massive wave of popular support with a very clear, singular mandate.
nationalize the oil.
Exactly. Nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He wanted to completely cancel the British concession and ensure that Iran's wealth actually benefited Iranians.
Which makes total sense from his perspective. But the British government naturally views this as an absolute existential threat to their post-war economic recovery.
Oh, they panic.
Yeah, so how do they respond to a sovereign nation simply nationalizing its own resources?
They respond with absolute economic warfare. I mean, the British essentially implement a global blockade on Iranian oil.
Wow.
Yeah. They threaten any international tanker that tries to dock in Iran with legal action or direct naval interception.
So they just cut them off from the global market entirely.
Completely. And this blockade plunges the Iranian economy into absolute freefall. But Mossadegh refuses to blink.
He holds his ground.
He does. He is totally willing to endure economic hardship for the sake of national sovereignty. But the British soon realized that economic pressure alone isn't going to break him.
And they can't just militarily invade Iran. Right, that would trigger a massive international crisis.
Right, exactly. So they turned to Washington for help.
And this is where the Cold War dynamics completely hijack local politics. Because under President Truman, the U.S. had actually been somewhat sympathetic to Mossadegh's nationalist goals. Right?
They really were. Truman kind of saw that the era of British colonialism was ending. He wasn't eager to back the British on this.
But then the administration changes.
Dwight D. Eisenhower takes office.
Yeah.
And his administration, which is heavily influenced by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles,
The Dulles brothers.
the Dulles brothers, they view the entire globe through the very specific lens of the Soviet threat. The Cold War paranoia is at its absolute peak right now.
Right.
So the British intelligence services, MI6, they recognize this American vulnerability. And they brilliantly reframed their economic problem in Iran.
How so?
Well, they stopped talking to the Americans about lost oil revenues, and they started talking about the domino theory.
Ah, of course.
They argue that Mossadegh's economic instability, the instability the British caused, mind you, is creating a massive power vacuum.
And let me guess, the communists are going to fill it.
Exactly. They tell the CIA that the local Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, is poised to seize control and hand Iran's massive oil reserves directly to the Soviet Union.
So they basically use the American fear of communism to get the CIA to do their dirty work.
Precisely. The U.S. gets involved not initially for the oil itself, but under the guise of geopolitical containment. So in 1953, the CIA, working hand in glove with British MI6, orchestrates Operation Ajax.
But they don't send in an invading army, right?
Oh no, they use covert action. The CIA funnels massive amounts of cash into Tehran to bribe military officers, politicians, newspaper editors.
Buying up influence where they can.
Exactly. They even hire street gangs and weightlifters from the local bazaars to stage massive violent protests in the streets.
Wait, weightlifters?
Yeah, literally street thugs and strongmen. They actually orchestrate fake communist rallies to terrify the conservative religious clerics into thinking a Soviet takeover is imminent.
Oh, wow.
And then they turn around and fund royalist counter-rallies to fight the fake communists they just paid.
So they intentionally manufacture total chaos in the streets of the capital just to make the democratic government look entirely incapable of maintaining order.
And the engineered chaos works perfectly. The military, backed by the CIA, moves in, arrests Mossadegh, and officially topples Iran's democratically elected government.
Just like that.
Just like that. And in his place, the U.S. and Britain consolidate absolute political power in the hands of the monarch.
Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran.
Exactly.
Let's pause and just look at the metaphor here for a second. It's like the United States helped build a massive societal pressure cooker in 1953.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. By overthrowing Mossadegh, they poured this boiling resentment into the Iranian populace. Then they take the lid shut with the Shah's authoritarian rule, clamped it down tight with American military backing, and then just completely ignored the whistling of the steam for the next 25 years.
That analogy holds up perfectly, especially when you look at exactly how the Shah maintained the seal on that pressure cooker.
How did he do it?
Well, he knew he lacked broad popular legitimacy because, everyone in the country knew a foreign power had placed him on the throne.
He was a puppet.
Basically, yeah. So to survive, he had to rule through fear. He established this incredibly brutal domestic secret police and intelligence service known as SAVAK.
And our sources note that SAVAK wasn't just some organic domestic creation, right?
No, not at all. It was initially trained and organized with the direct help of the CIA and Israeli intelligence.
Man. So the U.S. fingerprint is on the very instrument of the Iranian people's daily oppression.
It is. And SAVAK became infamous throughout the 1960s and 70s. They were omnipresent. They suppressed any form of political dissent, they heavily censored the press, and they engaged in horrific human rights abuses.
We're talking torture, right?
Widespread torture, arbitrary arrests, the outright disappearance of political dissidents. The Iranian public is basically living in a state of constant terror.
But on the international stage, the Shah is parading around, presenting himself as this progressive, modernizing monarch.
Exactly. He's throwing lavish parties and talking about the future.
Which brings us to a major domestic policy mentioned in the source material, the White Revolution. The Shah decides he is going to forcefully drag Iran into the 20th century, whether the population wants it or not.
Right, the White Revolution. This was launched in the early 1960s. It was a series of massive top-down reforms heavily supported by the U.S. government.
What were the actual reforms?
Well, the Shah wanted to rapidly westernize the country's economy and its social structure. So this included breaking up massive rural estates for land reform, expanding women's suffrage, and pouring huge amounts of money into urban industrialization.
On paper, to a Western observer, those sound like fairly progressive steps.
On paper, sure. But implementation is everything.
Right. So how did these reforms actually hit the ground in Iran?
They hit the ground like a wrecking ball. The land reforms were deeply flawed. They ended up displacing millions of rural peasants who then just flooded into the cities looking for work that didn't exist.
Creating these massive, impoverished urban slums.
Exactly. And the economic benefits of the industrialization, those were completely concentrated in the hands of a tiny, corrupt elite surrounding the royal court.
Of course.
The traditional merchant class in the bazaars, they felt their livelihoods were just being destroyed by foreign imports and state-run monopolies.
And most critically, he completely alienates the religious sector.
He does. He essentially declares cultural war on the ulema, the Islamic religious scholars and clerics.
Why?
Because the Shah viewed the traditional Islamic establishment as this backward obstacle to his grand modern vision. So he systematically stripped away their control over education and family law.
He even messed with the calendar, didn't he?
Yeah. He replaced the traditional Islamic calendar with a royalist calendar. So to the deeply religious rural and working class populations, the Shah wasn't just an authoritarian dictator.
He was a threat to their religion.
He was actively trying to erase their faith and their identity and replace it with this hollow Western secular materialism.
So this creates a massive societal void. You have a terrified, displaced, deeply resentful population with absolute no democratic outlet to express their grievances.
Not at all.
And this is where one of the academic sources on political science introduces a vital concept that completely unlocked this history for me. It's called schema theory.
Ah, yes. Schema theory is essential for understanding the communication breakdown between Washington and Tehran.
Walk us through it.
Well, in cognitive psychology, a schema is basically a mental framework. It's the lens through which you organize and interpret new information based on your past experiences.
Okay.
You don't view events in a vacuum, right? You view them through your established schema.
So let's apply that directly to 1979. What is the American schema going into this?
For the United States government, and certainly for the American public watching the evening news, the inciting incident of bad relations with Iran is the embassy takeover.
That's day one for them.
That is the start of their timeline. Therefore, their schema dictates that the hostage crisis is this completely unprovoked, irrational, and barbaric act of aggression against innocent diplomats by a bunch of religious fanatics.
But the Iranian revolutionaries are operating on a completely different timeline.
A completely different timeline. For the Iranians, their schema is entirely rooted in the trauma of 1953.
Right.
When they look at the United States Embassy in Tehran, they do not see a protected space of diplomatic goodwill. They see the literal physical headquarters where the CIA actively plotted the destruction of their democracy.
Wow.
Yeah, their cognitive framework is defined by a deep-seated and frankly entirely rational fear that the United States is always looking for a way to intervene and crush their self-determination.
Because they've seen it happen.
Exactly. They had historical, documented proof that the U.S. was capable of overthrowing their government to protect its own interests.
That entirely reframes the psychology of the crisis. I mean, they aren't just angry, they are functioning from a place of intense historical paranoia.
They are terrified of history repeating itself.
So how does this pressure cooker finally start to fail? We hit the late 1970s and the whistling gets deafening.
It does. By 1977 and 1978, the economic miracle the Shah had promised starts to totally collapse. There is a massive global recession. High inflation hits Iran hard.
And that wealth gap we talked about.
Oh, it becomes physically unignorable. You have the elite driving imported sports cars in northern Tehran, while the impoverished masses in the southern slums are starving.
So people start taking to the streets.
Right. Small protests start breaking out, demanding economic release and political reform, and the Shah, true to form, responds with Savak and violent police crackdowns.
But violence doesn't put the lid back on, it just turns the heat up.
Because every time the police kill a protester, Islamic tradition dictates a mourning period of 40 days.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so 40 days after a violent clash, massive crowds gather to mourn the dead. The police fire on the mourners, creating new martyrs.
Which starts a new 40-day clock.
Exactly. 40 days later, even larger crowds gather. It creates this rhythmic, compounding cycle of escalation that the Shah's security forces simply cannot contain.
And then we hit the breaking point.
The breaking point comes on September 8, 1978.
Black Friday.
Black Friday. Massive demonstrations take place in Jela Square in Tehran. The Shah declares martial law, but the crowds just refuse to disperse.
They're past the point of being afraid.
They are. So the military arrives with tanks and helicopter gunships, and they open fire directly into the dense crowd of demonstrators.
That's horrific.
Dozens, possibly hundreds of unarmed civilians are slaughtered right in the streets. After Black Friday, the possibility of reform or compromise is completely dead.
There's no going back.
The public demand shifts universally from "we want economic changes" to "the Shah must be destroyed."
And stepping into this absolute chaos is Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, the mechanics of his rise are incredible to me because he isn't even in the country.
No, he's far away.
He has been in exile for 14 years. How does a cleric sitting in a suburb of Paris lead a massive revolution in the Middle East?
It's amazing. He does it through an incredibly innovative use of early communication technology.
Okay, tell me more.
Khomeini recognized that he couldn't rely on the state-controlled television or newspapers to spread his message, right? Savak controlled all of that. He needed a decentralized, uncensorable network, and he found it in the audio cassette tape.
It's like a 1970s analog version of a viral social media campaign.
It really is. While living in exile in Neaufle-Château, France, Khomeini would record these blistering, fiery sermons. He brilliantly merged religious rhetoric with anti-imperialist political goals.
He denounced the Shah.
He denounced the Shah as a corrupt tyrant, and he famously labeled the United States as the Great Satan, the puppet master pulling the Shah's strings.
And he's just recording these on a standard tape deck.
On a standard cassette tape. His aides would then use the international telephone lines, which, by the way, the Shah's security forces couldn't easily monitor entirely, to play the audio over the phone to supporters sitting in safe houses in Tehran.
Wait, so they're essentially transmitting the master copy over a long-distance phone call?
Yes. The supporters in Tehran would record the audio off the phone receiver. Then, they take that master tape to the grand bazaars, where underground networks of merchants use high-speed dubbing machines to create tens of thousands of copies within hours.
That is so resourceful.
And then these cassettes are distributed to the sprawling network of thousands of mosques across the entire country.
So suddenly his voice is everywhere.
Everywhere. By Friday prayers, millions of Iranians are listening to Khomeini's voice echoing out of boomboxes, organizing general strikes, and providing the moral framework for the revolution.
The intelligence failure here on the U.S. side is just staggering. I mean, the U.S. is spending billions monitoring Soviet troop movements with satellites, but they completely miss a revolution being organized on cheap plastic cassette tapes in the local bazaar.
Oh, the U.S. intelligence apparatus was completely blind to the religious undercurrents of Iranian society. They talked to the Shah's generals, they talked to Western-educated diplomats, but they didn't talk to the clerics or the merchants.
But not everyone was blind, right?
No. Our sources include a fascinating eyewitness account from a British diplomat named Desmond Harney. He was stationed in Tehran during the massive protests of late 1978.
What was Harney seeing that Washington was missing?
Harney was actually going out into the streets, observing the massive Ashura processions. These were million-man marches, combining deep religious mourning with intense political fury.
And what did he write?
He wrote in his diary that the warning signs were flashing bright red for anyone willing to look. He described the sheer scale and discipline of the crowds, noting that the entire structure of the Shah's regime was about to be swept away in what he called an appalling revolution.
So he knew it was over.
He saw that the Shah had lost the mandate of heaven, so to speak. But official Washington, which was deeply dependent on the Shah as their primary pillar of stability and oil security in the Persian Gulf, they simply refused to accept that his fall was inevitable until it was way too late.
They ignored the whistling, the lid blows off, and the pressure cooker explodes.
Boom.
In January 1979, the Shah realizes his military can no longer control the streets without committing mass genocide. So he boards a plane, theoretically going on an extended vacation, and flees the country.
And he never returns.
Never returns. 2 weeks later, Air France Flight 472 touches down in Tehran, and Ayatollah Khomeini steps off the plane.
And the reception is euphoric. Millions of Iranians line the streets. It is literally the largest welcoming committee in human history.
And the monarchy just collapses.
The monarchy collapses entirely a few days later when the military declares neutrality. The revolution is essentially won.
Wow.
A provisional government is quickly established, led by a moderate, Western-educated prime minister named Mehdi Bazargan, and the country officially declares itself an Islamic Republic.
Okay, so the Shah is gone, Khomeini is back, there's a new government, the revolution achieved its primary goal.
Right.
But the kitchen is still on fire, and the tension with the United States hasn't evaporated. Which brings us to the specific spark in late 1979. What takes us from a successful domestic revolution to an international hostage crisis?
It comes down to a medical crisis that triggers a massive geopolitical miscalculation.
Okay.
The exiled Shah is moving from country to country, Egypt, Morocco, Mexico, the Bahamas, seeking asylum. But he's also secretly suffering from advanced lymphoma.
Oh, I see.
By late 1979, his cancer is severely worsening. He requires highly specialized medical treatment and surgery that is really only available in the United States.
And President Jimmy Carter is sitting in the Oval Office staring at a terrible dilemma.
A nightmare dilemma. Carter knows perfectly well that the situation in Tehran is incredibly volatile. I mean, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran had actually been briefly overrun by Marxist militants back in February of 1979, before the provisional government forces arrived to secure it and hand it back.
So they've already had a close call.
Right. The embassy staff, led by the top diplomat, Bruce Langan, sent frantic cables to Washington, warning that if the U.S. admits the Shah, even for medical treatment, it will be viewed as a massive provocation.
They explicitly warned him.
They explicitly stated it would put the lives of the American diplomatic staff in extreme, immediate danger.
Okay, if the State Department is explicitly saying on the record, do not do this, it will get us attacked, why on earth does Carter agree to let him in?
Because he faces a staggering pressure campaign from the American political and financial elite.
Who specifically?
You have highly influential figures like former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller.
Rockefeller. From Chase Bank.
Exactly. Rockefeller is the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, which handled billions of dollars of the Shah's personal wealth.
Follow the money.
Always.
Yeah.
They launch a concerted lobbying effort, hammering the Carter administration in the press and behind closed doors. They argue that turning away an incredibly loyal, longtime American ally in his hour of medical need is a profound moral failure.
They're framing it as a loyalty test.
Yes. They argue it makes the United States look weak and disloyal to its friends globally.
So the political pressure just completely overrides the diplomatic intelligence.
Including.
On October 22, 1979, Carter folds. He authorizes the Shah to enter the United States and travel to a hospital in New York City.
Yep.
Now, put us back into schema theory. Carter says it's a humanitarian medical visa. How does this play out on the streets of Tehran?
It is the ultimate confirmation of their absolute darkest paranoid fears. Remember their 1953 schema?
Right, the coup.
In 1953, the Shah briefly fled the country. The Americans and British schemed in the background, and then the CIA staged a coup to destroy the Iranian government and put the Shah back on the throne.
It's the exact same setup.
Exactly. Now, in 1979, the Shah has fled the country. He travels to the United States, and he is meeting with the very power brokers who supported his dictatorship.
So they don't buy the cancer story?
To the Iranian revolutionaries, a medical visit is a laughable cover story. They are entirely convinced that the Shah is sitting in a hospital bed in New York alongside the CIA, actively drafting the blueprints for a second military coup to destroy their new Islamic Republic.
I mean, you can see why they'd think that. It's a match dropped into the powder keg.
Absolutely.
The reaction in Tehran is instantaneous. Massive crowds gather outside the U.S. Embassy walls, burning effigies of Jimmy Carter, burning American flags. The chants of Marg Bar America, death to America, become constant roar echoing through the streets.
It's deafening.
And out of this furious crowd emerges a specific coalition of students.
Right. They call themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They were heavily drawn from the engineering and science departments of Tehran's major universities.
So these aren't just random rioters.
No, these are educated, organized students. The key orchestrator is a student named Ibrahim Asgharzadeh. He gathers a core committee of student leaders, and they begin secretly planning an assault on the U.S. Embassy compound.
And when you look closely at the source documents outlining their original plan, it completely subverts the popular narrative.
Oh, completely.
Because this 444-day crisis that defined a generation was never actually meant to be a 444-day crisis.
Not even close. Asgharzadeh and the leadership committee recruited about 300 to 500 trusted students. Their goal was highly specific and entirely limited in scope.
What was the plan?
They intended to stage a classic symbolic university protest sit-in. The plan was to breach the compound, overcome the guards, gather the American diplomats, and hold them for a few hours, maybe a couple days maximum. During that short window, they would invite the global press in, release blistering manifestos denouncing the United States for harboring a criminal, and demand the Shah's extradition.
It was essentially supposed to be a weekend PR stunt. I mean, they literally showed up with placards that read, "Don't be afraid, we just want to sit in."
Right.
They expected the Iranian government to intervene.
They fully anticipated that the moderate provisional prime minister, Mehdi Bazargan, would eventually send the Iranian security forces to cut the locks, arrest the students, and restore the embassy to the Americans.
Wait, so why do it if you know you'll just get arrested?
It was a calculated domestic political move to embarrass Bazargan's moderate faction and force them to take a harder line against the U.S.
Okay, so Sunday morning, November 4th, a female student cuts the heavy chains on the gates. The wave of hundreds of students pours over the brick walls of the massive 27-acre embassy compound.
It's a huge facility.
What is happening inside the buildings as the Americans realize they are being overrun?
Inside the main Chancery building, absolute panic sets in. The U.S. Marine security guards are heavily outnumbered. They have tear gas and shotguns, but their strict rules of engagement dictate that they cannot use deadly force against a civilian crowd unless it is absolutely necessary to save lives.
So they can't just start shooting.
Right. Opening fire on hundreds of Iranian students would cause an incredible bloodbath, turn the students into martyrs, and create a catastrophic international incident. So the Marines fall back, lock the heavy steel doors, and buy time.
Time for what, though?
Time for the embassy staff to execute emergency destruction protocols. You have to remember, the embassy is a hub of CIA intelligence operations for the entire region.
Oh, right.
There are mountains of highly classified documents, informant identities, and communication ciphers that absolutely cannot fall into the hands of the revolutionaries. So the staff rushes to the vault and begins desperately trying to destroy everything.
But the technology fails them at the worst possible moment.
It's a total disaster. They have this heavy-duty industrial incinerator designed to burn classified documents into unrecognizable ash.
Sounds perfect.
It would have been, but because of the sheer volume of paper they were trying to destroy in a panic, the incinerator jams and completely malfunctions.
Oh, no.
So the staff is forced to resort to standard, cheap office paper shredders.
Just normal shredders.
Yeah, and these aren't modern microcut shredders either. They just cut the paper into long, thin, vertical strips.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
They spend hours furiously feeding top-secret CIA cables through these cheap shredders before the students finally break through the reinforced doors and take the staff hostage?
Right.
Think about the scene. The students storm the vault, they find the Americans, and they find dozens of massive garbage bags filled with millions of strips of shredded paper.
And what the students do next is just one of the most unbelievable logistical feats I've ever heard.
Tell them.
They recognize immediately that those shredded papers will hold the secrets of American intelligence. So the student leaders gather up all the bags and take them to a secure location.
All right.
Then they go out into the bazaars of Tehran and hire highly skilled traditional Persian carpet weavers.
Carpet weavers?
Yes. These are artisans trained to recognize microscopic patterns and work with incredible manual dexterity. The students sit these weavers down, along with local school children, on the floors of these large halls.
Wow.
And for months and years, piece by tiny piece, looking at the ragged edges of the paper and the partial letters of English text, they painstakingly reconstruct the shredded CIA documents, like the world's most complex high-stakes jigsaw puzzle.
It's staggering. I mean, my brain hurts just thinking about it. And they didn't just rebuild a few pages.
They rebuilt an entire archive. The Iranian government eventually published these reconstructed documents in an astonishing 77-volume set titled Documents from the U.S. Espionage Den.
77 volumes.
Volumes. These contained raw cables detailing CIA contacts, assessments of Iranian politicians, regional strategies. The students paraded these documents in front of the press as absolute, undeniable proof that the embassy wasn't a diplomatic mission, but a den of spies actively working to subvert the revolution.
So this massive intelligence breach just poured gasoline on the public's paranoia.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so the students are inside, they have the hostages, they are rebuilding the documents. But as we established earlier, they expected the moderate prime minister, Mehdi Bazargan, to send the police to kick them out by Monday morning.
Right, that was the plan.
Why didn't the police show up? Why did a weekend sit-in become a permanent occupation?
What's fascinating here is the brilliant, ruthless, domestic political maneuvering of Ayatollah Khomeini.
How so?
Here is the critical context. Khomeini did not order this takeover. The student leaders actually debated telling him beforehand, but a close clerical advisor warned them not to. Because if Khomeini knew in advance, as the supreme moral authority of the country, he might feel obligated to order them to stop just to maintain diplomatic order for Bazargan's government.
Oh. So the students deliberately went rogue so Khomeini could maintain plausible deniability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But once the breach happens, Khomeini is sitting in the holy city of Qom watching the reaction. He sees tens of thousands of ecstatic Iranians flooding the streets surrounding the embassy, cheering for the students, completely galvanized by this massive strike against the great Satan.
He sees an opportunity.
Khomeini instantly recognizes that the students have just handed him the ultimate political weapon.
How does he use it?
He co-opts the entire movement. He goes on the radio and publicly, fervently endorses the takeover. He calls it a second revolution greater than the first.
Wow.
And this single statement completely shifts the tectonic plates of Iranian power.
Because it paints anyone who opposes the takeover as an enemy of the revolution.
Precisely. Post-revolution Iran was incredibly fractured. You had moderate Democrats, Marxist guerrilla groups, secular nationalists, and Khomeini's hardline theocrats all fighting for control of the new government's direction.
A total power struggle.
Right. By rallying the entire nation against a singular external enemy, the United States Khomeini unified the fractured populace behind his specific extremist vision. It totally silenced all domestic opposition.
If you spoke out against the hostage-taking, you were labeled an American sympathizer and a traitor.
Which is a political death sentence for Prime Minister Bazargan.
Bazargan was entirely humiliated, right?
Totally. I mean, he had just met with President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in Algiers days prior, trying to normalize relations. Now his own country's supreme leader was endorsing a blatant violation of international law.
He must have felt so powerless.
He realized he had absolutely zero power to govern. 2 days after the takeover, Bazargan and his entire moderate cabinet resigned in protest.
So let me get this straight. By climbing a wall to protest the U.S., the students accidentally overthrew their own provisional government.
That's exactly what happened. And with Bazargan out of the way, Khomeini's hardline clerics completely absorbed the state apparatus.
They took total control.
They used the massive surge in anti-American nationalism to rapidly push through a controversial referendum, establishing a new constitution. one that granted Khomeini supreme, unquestionable political and religious authority.
And the students.
The students sitting inside the embassy realized that no one was coming to kick them out. The symbolic sit-in had calcified into a permanent geopolitical siege.
Which means the Americans locked inside are trapped. This pulls us into the dark heart of the narrative. Let's talk about the reality for the hostages.
It's grim.
66 Americans were originally captured on November 4th, but that number drops fairly quickly, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Within the first few weeks, Khomeini issues a decree to release 13 of the hostages, specifically the female and African-American embassy staff.
Why them specifically?
This is a highly calculated propaganda move. Khomeini stated that women held a special place in Islam and therefore shouldn't be held prisoner. More pointedly, he released the black Americans to highlight the systemic racism and hypocrisy of the United States regarding its own civil rights record.
Wow.
He argued the black Americans were already oppressed by the U.S. government and shouldn't be punished further.
What about the others?
Well, one additional hostage, a vice consul named Richard Queen, was released in July of 1980 after he developed severe neurological symptoms. Those were later diagnosed as multiple sclerosis.
Leaving 52 American diplomats, military personnel, and intelligence officers trapped in the compound for the full 444 days.
52 people.
Now, if you were a Western journalist interviewing the Iranian government at the time, they painted a very specific, almost bizarre picture of what was happening behind those walls.
The official propaganda was relentless and deeply cynical. Iranian officials, like their chargé d'affaires in Washington, Ali Agha, would routinely hold press conferences claiming, "We are not mistreating anyone. They are our guests. They are being given the best food and are very well taken care of."
Guests?
Yeah. The student leader, Asgharzadeh, constantly pushed the narrative that their goal was simply to dramatize Iran's dignity to the world using, quote, gentle and respectful treatment.
Wait, so I have to stop you there. Gentle treatment. Our source documents are filled with accounts of mock executions. How on earth do the captors square the noble rhetoric of a righteous Islamic revolution with the sadistic reality of torturing tied-up diplomats? Was it just a complete lie for the cameras?
It is a profound example of how revolutionary zeal breeds cognitive dissonance and how mob mentality thrives in a vacuum of professional discipline. You have to remember, the captors weren't trained military wardens. They were college students in their early 20s who suddenly held absolute life-or-death power over the representatives of the global superpower they blamed for all their country's suffering.
That's a dangerous mix.
Very. The leadership committee may have genuinely intended for a peaceful, symbolic detention. But inside the compound, they divided the hostages up into small groups, scattered them across different rooms and basements, and handed control over to younger, militant guards. Decentralized control led to unchecked sadism.
Because once you define someone as the great Satan, you stop seeing them as a human being.
Exactly. Dehumanization is the prerequisite for torture. The guards didn't see a 50-year-old father from Ohio. They saw the embodiment of the CIA.
And the psychological torture they inflicted was horrific.
Beyond horrific. The hostages were routinely blindfolded whenever they were moved or whenever a guard entered the room. They were bound hand and foot, sometimes for days or weeks straight, causing severe nerve damage.
I can't even imagine.
For the first few months, they were absolutely forbidden from speaking to one another. You had people sitting in the same room for weeks in absolute terrifying silence.
And when the silence broke, it was often for interrogations.
Brutal, terrifying interrogations. The guards were desperate to force the hostages to confess to being CIA spies. They would drag hostages out of bed in the middle of the night.
And you mentioned mock executions.
This was a recurring tactic. Guards would drag a blindfolded hostage into a hallway, force them to their knees, press the cold barrel of a weapon against the back of their head, rack the slide, and pull the trigger on an empty chamber.
This is just sick.
They subjected them to Russian roulette just to watch them break down in terror. There were threats to amputate limbs, threats to boil their feet in hot oil.
The psychological strain must have been unimaginable. The sources highlight the story of Jerry Meal.
Yeah, Jerry Meal's story is deeply tragic. He was a CIA communications technician. He was naturally a very quiet, withdrawn, anxious man, which made him an easy target for the guards' cruelty.
They zeroed in on him.
They relentlessly mocked him. At one point, the guards actually rigged up a chair with wires to look like an electric chair and told Mealy they were going to execute him.
My God.
The compounding mental strain was so severe that Mealy had suffered a total psychological break. In a desperate suicide attempt, he violently smashed his own head into the sharp metal corner of a door frame, knocking himself unconscious and causing severe trauma.
That's heartbreaking. And for those who tried to fight back, the punishment was solitary confinement.
Michael Matrenko is the prime example of resistance. He was a political officer who spoke fluent Farsi. He understood exactly what the guards were saying, and he refused to be cowed.
He fought back.
He frequently cursed out the guards and openly expressed his utter contempt for Ayatollah Khomeini. In retaliation, they subjected him to immense physical punishment. He spent months and months in solitary confinement.
Just alone in a cell.
After one outburst, he was kept tightly handcuffed for 2 straight weeks. After another, he was severely beaten and locked in a freezing, unheated cell in the dead of winter for a fortnight.
Amidst all this darkness, though, there are accounts of incredible emotional resilience. I want to highlight the press attaché, Barry Rosen.
Barry Rosen's perspective is one of the most profoundly moving accounts in the archival material. Rosen wasn't just a bureaucrat. He had deep roots in the country. He had served in Iran years earlier as a Peace Corps volunteer.
Oh, so he really knew the place.
He spoke fluent Farsi. He understood the culture, the poetry, the history, and he genuinely loved the Iranian people. When the embassy was taken, he was subjected to the same terrifying mock executions and grueling interrogations as everyone else.
But psychologically, he managed to build a wall between his specific captors and the nation as a whole.
He completely refused to let the trauma poison his worldview.
He consciously maintained his humanity.
He later reflected, "I was a victim of the revolution, but that doesn't change my basic attitude about Iran. I don't want to live in hate."
Wow.
To endure 444 days of sensory deprivation, fear, and abuse in a basement, and emerge with your capacity for empathy intact. It is a staggering testament to human endurance.
It really is. Now, while the 52 hostages are enduring this nightmare inside the embassy, there is a tiny glimmer of hope happening elsewhere in Tehran. On the day of the takeover, the net didn't catch everyone. Let's talk about the Canadian caper.
Oh, this is the one truly triumphant covert operation of the entire crisis.
It's like something out of a movie.
Literally. So the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was a massive compound with multiple buildings. While the main chancery was being overrun by hundreds of students, a small group of 6 American diplomats were working in a separate consular building to the edge of the compound.
And they see what's happening.
When they saw the students breaching the gates and the Marines falling back, they realized the compound was lost. So they slipped out a side exit right into the chaotic streets of Tehran.
But they are high-profile American diplomats in a city where millions of people are chanting "Death to America." They have nowhere to go.
Right, so for several terrifying days, they're essentially fugitives. They bounce from safe house to safe house, hiding in the empty apartments of British and American expats who had already fled the country.
But that's entirely unsustainable.
Yeah, eventually one of them, John Sheardown, reaches out to the Canadian embassy. And the Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, makes an incredibly courageous decision. He agrees to grant them sanctuary.
Which puts the entire Canadian diplomatic mission in extreme jeopardy. I mean, if the Revolutionary Guards find out Canada is hiding Americans, they might storm the Canadian embassy next.
The risk was immense. But Ambassador Taylor and his staff hide the 6 Americans for months while working a secret backdoor channel with the Canadian government in Ottawa and the CIA in Washington to figure out an extraction plan.
Because they can't just drive them to the airport.
No. Revolutionary Guards are heavily scrutinizing every single passport. They need a bulletproof cover story.
Enter the CIA's master of disguise, Tony Mendez.
The CIA realizes that the only cover story crazy enough to work is one that plays on the global perception of Western eccentricities. So Mendez flies to Hollywood and literally sets up a fake movie production company.
He buys a real script, right?
He buys a script for a sci-fi fantasy film called Argo. They even take out full-page advertisements in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter to establish a paper trail.
And the pitch is that a Canadian film crew is traveling the globe looking for exotic desert locations to shoot this sci-fi epic.
Exactly. The Canadian government takes the unprecedented step of issuing 6 legitimate Canadian passports under fake names for the Americans.
Incredible.
Mendez flies into Tehran under the guise of an Irish film producer. He meets the 6 Americans, gives them a crash course in their fake identities as directors, location scouts, and set designers, and dresses them in flamboyant 1970s Hollywood clothing.
It's so audacious it borders on the absurd.
And that's exactly why it works. In late January 1980, the group walks directly into the chaotic Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran. They present their fake Canadian passports and forged Iranian visas to the Revolutionary Guards.
And the guards buy it.
The Guards buy the story of the eccentric filmmakers. The 6 Americans board a Swiss Air flight and escaped to freedom. It was a massive intelligence victory, heavily popularized decades later by the movie Argo.
But the euphoria of the Canadian caper is short-lived because while 6 Americans are safe, 52 are still chained to radiators.
Exactly.
And back in the United States, those 52 hostages are doing something unprecedented. They're completely hijacking the American news cycle. Let's shift our focus to Washington and the media circus.
The Iran hostage crisis fundamentally alters the relationship between the American media, the public, and foreign policy.
How so?
Well, prior to 1979, international crises were usually digested by the public through newspapers and maybe short evening news summaries. The hostage crisis was arguably the first major geopolitical event to be consumed by the American public as a daily, intensely emotional television serial.
I think about how a crisis is handled today. If something happens, it's trending on social media for maybe 48 hours, and then the algorithm feeds us a new outrage. But in 1979, the media environment was a captive audience. There were only 3 major television networks.
And all 3 networks locked onto the embassy gates and just refused to look away. The visual imagery was incredibly potent. Blindfolded Americans, angry young students burning the stars and stripes, Ayatollah Khomeini's stern, uncompromising face.
It was perfect television.
It really was. Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, who was widely considered the most trusted man in America at the time, made a fateful editorial decision.
What did you do?
He began ending his nightly broadcast by ticking off the duration of the crisis. He would look into the camera and say, "And that's the way it is, Friday, January 4th, the 62nd day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran."
That is a constant, unrelenting drumbeat ringing in the ears of the American public, and more importantly, in the ears of the president.
And the coverage birthed entirely new formats of journalism. ABC News executives realized the public appetite for updates was just insatiable, so they launched a late-night dedicated news program called The Iran Crisis, America Held Hostage, anchored by young Ted Koppel.
And that eventually becomes Nightline, right?
Yes. It was so massively popular that it evolved into the permanent news program Nightline. The media basically forged a deep, parasocial relationship between the American viewers and the hostages. The public felt like their own brothers and fathers were being tortured in that basement.
So how does that intense emotional connection impact Jimmy Carter's ability to actually solve the problem?
This raises an important question, right? Because it creates a massive political trap. Initially, in the weeks right after the takeover, Carter experiences a classic rally-round-the-flag effect.
Does his numbers go up?
His approval ratings absolutely skyrocketed, jumping 26 points. The nation unites behind him. Citizens tie yellow ribbons around oak trees. High school students organize drives to send thousands of Christmas cards to the embassy. There is a profound sense of national solidarity.
But unity fueled by anxiety has a very short shelf life.
Exactly. You can only maintain solidarity if there is a clear path to victory. As the days bleed into weeks and weeks into months, the media's daily drumbeat stops feeling like a sign of unity and starts feeling like a glaring spotlight on American impotence.
While Carter is just trying to negotiate.
Right, Carter is trying to play a slow, methodical game of diplomatic chess. He freezes billions of dollars in Iranian assets in U.S. banks. He implements an embargo on Iranian oil. He tries to work back channels through the UN.
But when your citizens feel like their family members are being tortured on the evening news, they don't care about asset freezes.
Not at all.
They want the cavalry. They want action. The media coverage sounds like it turned international diplomacy into a reality show. It's like Carter was trying to play chess, but the media was forcing him to play beat the clock on national television.
That's spot on. Patient, behind-the-scenes diplomacy became politically lethal. Carter looked weak, paralyzed, and entirely at the mercy of Ayatollah Khomeini.
And the Republicans are just hammering him.
His political opponents hammer him daily for his inaction. By the spring of 1980, the pressure is unbearable. The diplomatic channels are completely frozen. The 1980 presidential election is looming, and Carter feels he has absolutely no choice left.
He authorizes the military option.
Yes.
April 1980. Operation Eagle Claw. This is perhaps one of the most complex, tragic, and consequential military failures in modern American history.
The audacity and complexity of Operation Eagle Claw cannot be overstated. The U.S. military is tasked with rescuing 52 hostages from a heavily guarded compound situated in the absolute center of a sprawling, hostile metropolis of several million people.
Which is located hundreds of miles inland from any friendly border or ocean.
Right. It requires incredible, unprecedented coordination between the Navy, Air Force, Army, and Marines.
Walk us through the plan. How are they supposed to pull this off?
The plan was a logistical tightrope. It required flying 8 massive RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters off the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea. They had to fly hundreds of miles deep into the Iranian desert at night, maintaining absolute radio silence to avoid radar detection.
Just flying in the dark.
They would land at a remote, pre-selected salt flat, designated as Desert 1.
And Desert 1 is just a staging area.
Correct. At Desert 1, they would rendezvous with a fleet of C-130 transport planes flying in from Oman. The C-130s were carrying the Delta Force Assault Team, commanded by Colonel Charles Beckwith, and massive rubber bladders of helicopter fuel.
Okay.
The helicopters would refuel from the C-130s in the dark desert, load the Delta Force operators, and fly to a second hiding spot in the mountains just outside Tehran.
So it's a multi-day operation.
Right, they would hide there all day. The next night, Delta Force would drive into Tehran in disguised trucks, assault the embassy, kill the guards, free the hostages, and call the helicopters into a nearby football stadium to extract everyone.
The margin for error is essentially zero. And even before the helicopters take off, there is massive, catastrophic fallout within Carter's own cabinet regarding this plan.
The internal debates were incredibly bitter. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was vehemently opposed to a military strike. He argued forcefully that it was a reckless gamble.
He thought it would fail.
He believed it would likely result in the deaths of the hostages, cause massive civilian casualties in Tehran, and potentially push Iran right into an alliance with the Soviet Union.
But Brzezinski pushed it through.
National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski heavily favored decisive military action. Brzezinski managed to push the final approval through the National Security Council while Vance was out of town on a weekend vacation.
Which is an incredible breach of protocol for a decision of this magnitude.
Vance was so furious and so morally opposed to the operation that he submitted his resignation to President Carter on principle before Eagle Claw even took place.
He knew it was going to be a disaster.
He did.
And tragically, he was right. April 24th, 1980, the helicopters lift off from the USS Nimitz. What happens as they enter Iranian airspace?
They encounter an enemy they didn't prepare for. The environment.
The weather.
The U.S. military's weather forecasting for the remote Iranian interior was incredibly poor. As the 8 helicopters fly low across the desert in the dark, they fly directly into a massive, severe, suspended dust storm known as a haboob.
It's essentially a blinding wall of fine talcum powder like sand.
And because they are operating under strict radio silence to avoid detection, the lead pilots cannot radio the pilots behind them to warn them of the weather front.
Oh no, so they just fly right into it.
Each helicopter flies blindly into the dust. The sand gets sucked into the engines, causing the internal temperatures to spike dangerously. The pilots lose all visual reference points. Some suffer severe vertigo.
It's a nightmare.
One helicopter's warning lights indicate a catastrophic rotor failure, so the pilot aborts and flies back to the aircraft carrier.
So they are down to 7 helicopters.
Then, a second helicopter's navigation and flight instruments completely fail in the dust storm. The pilot is flying blind in the dark. He is forced to land in the desert and abandon the aircraft.
Are they rescued?
The crew is picked up by another helicopter, but now they are down to 6. Finally, the remaining 6 battered helicopters emerge from the dust storms and arrive at the Desert 1 rendezvous point, heavily delayed and burning way more fuel than anticipated.
And 6 is the absolute bare minimum, right? The military planners calculated they needed 6 functioning helicopters to carry the weight of the Delta Force team and all 52 hostages.
Yes, 6 was the strict abort threshold. But when they landed Desert 1, the crews inspect the aircraft. They discover that a third helicopter has suffered a complete failure of its primary hydraulic system.
You're kidding.
It cannot fly safely. It is effectively grounded.
So they are down to 5 operational helicopters. They don't have enough lift capacity.
The ground commander, Colonel Beckwith, is faced with an agonizing, heartbreaking decision. He has trained his men for months for this exact moment. He is sitting in the Iranian desert, but the math doesn't work.
He has to call it.
He cannot complete the mission without risking leaving his own men or the hostages behind. He gets on the secure satellite radio, contacts the White House, and recommends aborting the entire rescue mission.
And Carter agrees.
President Carter listens to his commanders and agrees. The order is given to pack up and go home.
It's a bitter pill, a massive logistical failure, but at least they can evacuate without loss of life. But then the absolute worst-case scenario unfolds.
Chaos erupts during the evacuation. They're operating in total darkness on a remote salt flat. The air is thick with swirling sand kicked up by the rotors of the helicopters and the propellers of the C-130s.
No one can see anything.
As one of the helicopters lifts off to reposition itself so another aircraft can refuel, the pilot becomes disoriented in the blinding dust cloud. The heavy helicopter drifts sideways, and its main rotor blades slice directly into the fuselage of a parked C-130 transport plane.
A C-130 loaded with men and massive bladders of aviation fuel.
The collision triggers a massive, catastrophic explosion. A fireball lights up the desert night. The men inside the C-130 and the helicopter are instantly engulfed in flames.
God.
Delta Force operators frantically scramble out of the burning wreckage, but 8 American servicemen are killed in the inferno.
And they can't even stay to recover them, can they?
No, the heat is so intense that commanders realize ammunition and missiles on the burning aircraft are going to start cooking off. They order an immediate, panicked evacuation. The surviving troops board the remaining C-130s and flee Iranian airspace, leaving the burning wreckage, the bodies of their 8 comrades, and several completely intact, highly classified helicopters sitting abandoned in the desert.
It is a devastating, visceral defeat. How does President Carter handle the fallout the next morning?
He does something very rare in modern politics. He goes on national television, looks right into the camera, addresses the American people, and takes absolute singular responsibility for the failure.
He doesn't pass the buck.
He doesn't blame the pilots. He doesn't blame the commanders. He says, it was my decision. But politically, the imagery of burning American aircraft in the Iranian desert seals his fate. The narrative of Jimmy Carter as an ineffective, unlucky, and weak president is permanently locked into the minds of the voters.
And on the other side of the world, how does Ayatollah Khomeini react to the wreckage of Eagle Claw?
Khomeini achieves a propaganda victory beyond his wildest dreams. When the Iranian military arrives at Desert One and broadcasts footage of the burned American bodies and the abandoned helicopters, Khomeini addresses the nation.
He spins it.
He doesn't credit the Iranian military for defeating the Americans. He points to the dust storms. He claims that the sands of the desert were agents of God sent to smite the great Satan.
Divine intervention.
He frames the failure of Eagle Claw as absolute, undeniable proof of divine intervention. It skyrockets his prestige. It proves to the deeply religious populace that God is actively protecting their Islamic Republic. It entirely neuters any remaining moderate politicians in Iran who were quietly advocating for the release of the hostages.
So following the disaster at Desert One, the military option is in ashes. But our sources note that the Pentagon was so incredibly desperate to erase the humiliation that they actually began developing a backup plan.
Oh, this is wild.
And this plan, Operation Credible Sport, sounds less like a military strategy and more like a fever dream from a Hollywood stunt coordinator.
The desperation in Washington was palpable. They knew they couldn't try another complex helicopter rendezvous in the desert. So the engineers of the Pentagon came up with a radically different, borderline insane approach.
Whoa, was it?
They decided they were going to bypass helicopters entirely. They took an enormous C-130 cargo plane and physically strapped dozens of solid-fuel rocket engines to its fuselage, wings, and tail.
Rockets on a cargo plane.
Because a C-130 usually requires thousands of feet of runway to land. But they wanted to fly this massive plane directly into Tehran and land it inside the Shahid Shahrudi football stadium, right across the street from the U.S. Embassy.
A stadium?
Yeah. The plan was to ignite the forward-facing rockets just feet above the ground to act as extreme, violent brakes, stopping the massive aircraft inside the confines of a soccer pitch.
That's insane.
They would load the hostages under heavy fire and then ignite backward-facing rockets to blast the plane back out of the stadium like a fighter jet launching from a carrier.
I mean, the physics of that sound completely unsurvivable. Did they actually test this?
They did. They built a prototype and tested it at an airbase in Florida. And predictably, it ended in disaster.
Of course it did.
During a test flight, the pilot fired the braking rockets a fraction of a second too early while the plane was still airborne. The aircraft essentially stalled midair, plummeted to the tarmac, slammed down hard enough to shear off its starboard wing, and burst into flames.
Did they survive?
Miraculously, the test crew survived. But the Pentagon finally realized that sending a rocket-strapped cargo plane into a stadium in Tehran was a total suicide mission. Operation Credible Sport was immediately abandoned.
Which means the military option is completely definitively off the table. There are no more rescue plans. The clock is ticking relentlessly.
And Carter's running out of time.
Right. The November 1980 presidential election is looming over Carter. He is bleeding out politically. The hostages have been in captivity for nearly a year. How do we finally break the stalemate? What brings Iran back to the negotiating table?
The stalemate breaks because the geopolitical reality surrounding Iran drastically shifts. Two major events occur in the latter half of 1980 that completely change Ayatollah Khomeini's calculus.
What's the first one?
First, in July 1980, the exiled Shah finally succumbs to lymphoma and dies in a military hospital in Egypt.
So the primary vocal demand of the hostage takers, extradite the Shah so we can put him on trial and execute him, is suddenly moot. The man is dead.
Precisely. The original justification for the embassy seizure just evaporates. But the second, far more critical shift happens 2 months later, in September 1980.
Right, the war.
Saddam Hussein, the dictator of neighboring Iraq, looks at Iran and sees a country that is globally isolated, economically crippled by American sanctions, and whose military command structure has been decimated by revolutionary purges.
He sees vulnerability.
Saddam sees weakness, and he orders the Iraqi military to launch a massive, full-scale invasion of Iran.
The start of the devastating Iran-Iraq war. And suddenly, Iran's priorities shift from anti-American theatrics to basic national survival.
You cannot fight a massive conventional ground war against a heavily armed neighbor when your global supply chains are cut off. Iran desperately needed military spare parts for their American-made jets and tanks, and they needed massive infusions of cash.
Which they don't have.
Right, because billions of dollars of Iranian sovereign wealth were frozen in American and European banks by Jimmy Carter's executive orders. Furthermore, Iran needed the United States and the United Nations to focus on condemning Iraqi aggression, rather than focusing on the diplomats locked in a basement in Tehran.
The hostages have transitioned from being a political asset to a massive strategic liability, so they reach out to negotiate.
I do.
But after 400 days of calling each other the Great Satan and burning flags, they can't exactly pick up the phone and call the State Department directly, can they?
The animosity is far too deep for direct talks.
Yeah.
They need a neutral third party, an honest broker. So they turn to Algeria.
Why Algeria?
The Algerians were respected by Iran as a fellow Islamic non-aligned nation and respected by the U.S. as a functional diplomatic partner. A team of highly skilled Algerian diplomats essentially initiates a grueling campaign of shuttle diplomacy.
Just flying back and forth.
Yeah, flying back and forth between Washington and Tehran, carrying complex legal proposals, financial demands, and counteroffers, translating not just the language, but the deep mistrust between the two nations.
So what were the Iranians actually demanding to let the 52 Americans go?
The Iranian parliament, the Majlis, finally codified 4 absolute conditions. First, the U.S. must immediately unfreeze all Iranian financial assets. Second, the U.S. must locate and return the personal wealth the Shah and his family had allegedly stolen and hidden in Western banks.
Good luck with that one.
Right. Third, the U.S. must cancel all pending legal claims and lawsuits filed by American corporations against Iran. And fourth, the U.S. must sign a binding pledge of non-intervention, promising never to interfere in Iran's internal political or military affairs again.
These demands form the framework of what will become the Algiers Accords. But all of this intricate financial and diplomatic negotiation is happening under the immense, crushing shadow of the U.S. presidential election in November 1980. Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan.
And it is a bloodbath for Carter. The American public was exhausted by the economic stagnation, humiliated by the failure of Eagle Claw, and infuriated by the daily images of the hostages.
Reagan offers a total contrast.
Ronald Reagan projected strength, optimism, and an aggressive posture. He wins the election in a massive landslide. Carter becomes a lame duck president, but he is still absolutely obsessed with getting those hostages home before his term ends.
Now, this brings us to one of the most enduring, highly debated, and controversial theories of this entire saga. Whenever you research the 1979 crisis, you inevitably run into the October surprise theory.
Yeah.
Break down what that allegation actually entails.
The October surprise theory is a dark allegation of political treason. The theory asserts that during the summer and fall of 1980, representatives of Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, specifically campaign manager William Casey, who would later become CIA director, secretly met with high-level Iranian operatives in Europe.
And what was the alleged purpose of these secret meetings?
The allegation is that the Reagan campaign actively conspired with the Iranians to delay the release of the hostages.
To hurt Carter.
The theory claims the campaign told Iran, do not cut a deal with Jimmy Carter before the election. If you wait until after Reagan wins, we will give you a much better financial deal, and we will secretly facilitate the sale of weapons you need for the war with Iraq. By delaying the release, they would guarantee Carter's defeat.
That is an explosive charge. Is there actual documentary proof of this conspiracy?
It has been the subject of intense, ferocious investigation for decades. In the early 1990s, the U.S. Congress launched two massive, separate task forces, one in the House, one in the Senate, specifically to investigate these exact claims.
What did they find?
They interviewed hundreds of witnesses and reviewed thousands of classified documents. Both task forces ultimately concluded that there was no credible, verifiable evidence to support the theory that the Reagan campaign conspired with Iran to delay the release. The official record states it did not happen.
However, the rumors simply refused to die.
They refused to die because the waters remained so muddy. Over the decades, various individuals, including former Iranian officials, European arms dealers, and even some American political figures, have come forward claiming they were at these meetings or knew of them.
And then there's Iran-Contra.
Exactly. The subsequent Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration, where the U.S. did secretly sell weapons to Iran, cast a long shadow backward, making the October surprise theory feel very plausible to many observers.
I see.
But regardless of the absolute truth of those allegations, the actual documented timeline of how the crisis ended is undeniably cinematic. It is almost too perfectly scripted.
Let's paint the picture of the final day, January 20th, 1981. Inauguration Day in Washington. Jimmy Carter is spending his final hours in the Oval Office. He hasn't slept in 3 days.
Carter is running on absolute adrenaline and coffee. He is desperately managing an incredibly complex international financial transfer. The Algiers Accords have been signed. The core mechanism of the deal involves moving roughly $8 billion of previously frozen Iranian assets.
But Iran refuses to let the U.S. transfer it directly, right?
Yeah, so they use the Bank of England as an escrow account. The money is being wired from the Federal Reserve to London.
And in Tehran, the hostages are finally taken out of the embassy.
They are loaded onto buses and driven to Merabat Airport. 2 Air Algerie Boeing 727s are sitting on the tarmac waiting for them. The hostages are marched up the stairs and take their seats. The engines are running, but the planes do not move.
The Iranians are waiting for the money to clear.
They are waiting for the Bank of England to confirm receipt of the $8 billion. But they're also waiting for something far more symbolic. The money clears the bank. The Algerian intermediaries relay the message to Tehran, but the Iranian flight controllers still hold the planes on the tarmac.
They're watching the clock.
They wait until the precise, literal moment that Ronald Reagan stands on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, places his hand on the Bible, and begins taking the oath of office.
They intentionally time it to inflict the maximum possible humiliation on Jimmy Carter.
Exactly. Just minutes after Reagan finishes swearing in, officially terminating Jimmy Carter's presidency, the control tower in Tehran radios the Algerian pilots. The planes are cleared for takeoff.
Finally.
They throttle up, roar down the runway, and lift into the sky. Once they clear Iranian airspace, the 52 Americans who had been held in the dark for 444 agonizing days celebrate. Champagne is popped, they're finally free.
It's an incredible climax. The release on Reagan's inauguration day allowed his new administration to instantly project an image of renewed American strength and a new dawn.
Even though it was Carter who had done all the exhausting work.
Right. Carter did the deeply unpopular diplomatic legwork to secure the deal, but he was relegated to flying to a U.S. Air Force base in West Germany as a private citizen to greet the returning hostages.
Which leads us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. When the dust finally settles, when the yellow ribbons are taken down and the billions of dollars are transferred, who actually won the Iran hostage crisis?
If you look closely at the geopolitical aftermath detailed in the source material, it's really hard to argue that anyone truly walked away a winner.
The concept of victory here is a total mirage. Yes, Iran achieved its immediate tactical goal. They got their billions of dollars back. And Ayatollah Khomeini brilliantly weaponized the crisis to absolutely irrevocably solidify his theocratic grip on the country, crushing all domestic opposition.
But at what cost?
The long-term cost to the Iranian nation was catastrophic.
How does the academic source break down that cost?
The political science paper we analyzed highlights that the crisis transformed Iran into an international pariah. By blatantly violating the most sacred rule of international diplomacy, the absolute immunity of embassies, Iran isolated itself globally precisely at the moment it was being invaded by Iraq.
Worst possible timing.
The crisis created a blueprint for economic warfare. The severe international sanctions regime initiated by the U.S. during those 444 days didn't just vanish, it evolved. It established a precedent of crippling economic isolation that continues to strangle the Iranian economy to this very day.
And Khomeini himself changed, didn't he?
The crisis was the watershed moment where Khomeini transitioned from a pragmatic revolutionary leader into an uncompromising, isolated dogmatist.
And what about the cost to the United States?
For the U.S., the crisis birthed what diplomats call a towering wall of mistrust. The hostage crisis radically, permanently shifted American foreign policy in the Middle East.
It changed everything.
It completely destroyed the previous strategy of relying on Iran as the policeman of the Gulf. Instead, it initiated 4 decades of aggressive containment strategies, massive direct U.S. military buildups in the region, and disastrous proxy conflicts.
And it influenced the Iran-Iraq War, too.
Oh, heavily. The trauma of the crisis was so deep that throughout the 1980s, the United States actively supported and armed Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, turning a blind eye to his use of chemical weapons simply because they wanted to bleed the Iranian regime that had humiliated them.
Which eventually backfired spectacularly.
This support, of course, led to further catastrophic blowback for the U.S. in the decades that followed.
It is just a staggering story of unintended consequences. Let's recap the journey we've been on today.
Let's do it.
We took a deep dive into the anatomy of a crisis. We explored how the ghosts of a 1953 CIA-backed coup planted the seeds of a deep psychological terror in Iran.
Right. Schema theory.
Exactly. We saw how that terror exploded in 1979, turning what was supposed to be a weekend university protest into a 444-day geopolitical siege.
We looked at the horrific reality of the psychological torture inside the compound, contrasting it with the cynical propaganda of the regime.
And we examine how an unprecedented media saturation trapped an American president, forcing a catastrophic military failure in the desert, until a brutal neighboring war and geopolitical desperation finally forced an end to the standoff.
It was a violent collision of historical resentments, domestic power struggles, intense media narratives, and massive geopolitical miscalculations.
Yeah.
And it set a rigid status quo of hostility that the world is literally still grappling with today.
Before we wrap up, I want to turn it over to you for a final thought. Building on the sources we've discussed today, what is a provocative concept you want to leave the listener with?
Well, I want you to think about the role the media played in the pressure cooker of 1979.
Okay.
You had Walter Cronkite and just 3 major television networks counting the days. And that limited analog coverage alone was enough to paralyze a presidency, drive the public into an absolute frenzy, and force a deeply risky, disastrous military operation in the desert.
Just 3 channels did all that.
Right. Now, in today's digital world, where we live with a 247 cycle of social media, viral videos, ubiquitous smartphone cameras, and instant globalized outrage, could a government ever survive the political pressure of a 444-day hostage crisis? Or would an administration be entirely overthrown by the sheer weight of public opinion by week 2?
That is a deeply unsettling, fascinating question. The pressure cooker wouldn't take 444 days to explode today. With the heat of the modern internet, it might only take 44 hours.
Without a doubt, the speed of crisis has fundamentally changed.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical timelines, keep looking past the simple binary answers, and keep exploring the complex mechanisms of the world around you. We'll see you next time.